first, let's move to the session itself. This is about how much really can LGBT advocates in the region learn from broader diversity initiatives that are taking place or that have taken place, particularly around gender. And I have two distinguished panelists with me today who have a great deal of experience around that area, both areas, both gender and to some degree LGBT. And let me just introduce on my direct left, Gail Anthony, who's the General Manager Global Human Resources for Infinity Motor Company, and who has a lot of experience in the automotive industry, which is traditionally a very male-dominated industry. And Suzanne Price, on the far left here, President and Representative Director, Price Global, who's a consultant, a facilitator, and a coach. Gail, let's start with you, and let's go to this question. We've been discussing this earlier about, given your own experience with gender diversity, particularly in the automotive sector, I wonder if you begin by sharing with us some of your thoughts about what kind of progress has been made and why that progress and how that progress has been made in your sector.
Sure. I've been in the sector for about 20 years. And probably the biggest transition was made when legislation came into play. So organisations, whether they be big or small, the legislation suddenly made it not only just a nice thing to do and a good thing to do, but something that organisations had to pay attention to. And as a result of that legislation, organisations then needed to participate in having programs and policies and education programs around diversity and equality. Some organisations will do it better than others. Some do it at a compulsory level and a minimum compliance level, and others do it to try and institute major change. So what I've seen over the last 20 years is that organisations now are having to promote a culture of inclusion and respect amongst their workers, but it's really driven out of leadership, drive to do the right thing, rather than just legislation. So legislation now becomes almost a mandatory platform, but it's the drive for doing the right thing that actually gets the real change happening in an organisation.
Well, that's a point that I think we're going to come back to, but let's, one of the sort of strategies that has been used, or tactics that have been used in the gender diversity space, has been quotas. And I know that you have both some positive things to say about that and some negative things to say. What is it about quotas that works and what doesn't?
I personally don't agree with quotas. I think coming from Australia, I haven't experienced the sort of racial prejudice that, say, South Africa has, where they've been forced to implement extreme actions. But I think generally, for me, when you talk about quotas, it has the risk that it will actually have the opposite effect in terms of acceptance of the diversity candidates. So I believe actually that rather than quotas, putting in place more affirmative action processes further upstream, whether that be through your recruitment processes, your selection processes, identifying key talent and advantaging the groups to ensure that they're actually given the position to be considered, is a better way of doing this than actually forcing an organisation to force numbers in, which then run the risk that you put people in who are not ready, they fail, and then for those people who run different agendas, they go, see, it doesn't work. And so it actually has a negative impact. So I personally don't think quotas is the way to go in most organisations, in most countries, but I also appreciate that in some areas it's an extreme action to try and force change.
So it's not also something that necessarily can easily transfer onto the LGBT space either, is it? Because you don't in fact know quite often who is an LGBT person, and that makes it extremely difficult to pre-qualify people in a sense when you do the recruitment program.
Well, often with LGBT, it's the trust factor in an organisation that people feel safe to come out, and forcing quotas is not necessarily going to improve the trust level in that organisation to make people feel safe to be able to come out.
So what are some of the things that you put in place to make sure then, I mean, quotas aside, or affirmative early affirmative action aside, what are some of the things that you put in place to make your diversity programs successful?
So it's really a combination of things, and I was thinking about that when I came over here. It starts from having very clear policies around acceptable behaviour, what is and is not acceptable, defining that behaviour, and also defining consequence when that behaviour is not addressed. Making sure that your HR team and managers are trained on how to manage complaints and issues, but also to instil that culture. Making sure you have whistleblower systems in place so that if people are not confident to come forward with concerns, that they can do that through that process. And then looking at your people processes all the way through from recruitment and selection through to your development processes, your succession planning, your identification of your high potentials, your talent support programs, also ensuring that you've got education, but what is really important is around the leadership culture and making sure that your leaders are advocates and supporting of this. Now, you can't just tell a leader that they've got to be an advocate and a support. So it's really important, and I'm sure Suzanne will have some views on this, it's really important that as leaders in organisations, we're leading from the front around what we think is okay and what is not okay. I remember when I introduced a diversity program in a manufacturing organisation back in the mid-80s, and you used to be able to hear women walk around the plant because the wolf whistle used to follow them. And when we introduced the program in education, it was funny, it stopped overnight. And it was okay to go up and say to somebody, it's not okay to do that. But so often we see this behaviour, and as leaders we choose to ignore it rather than actually taking a stance and putting our neck on the line and saying it's actually not okay. And so it does take leaders to take that stance.
So when you look at LGBT as an issue in the automotive sector, I mean, I know that in a sense it's sort of bundled into the broader diversity issue, but you do choose, don't you, particularly in Infinity at the moment, to address LGBT issues on an almost case-by-case basis. Is that right? And you don't want to formally sort of acknowledge that set of that initiative in your own diversity program, is that right?
We talked about this before the session, and I've got to be absolutely honest. Most organisations are resource strapped. They don't have a lot of time, effort and energy to divert to everything, and so they have to prioritise what they do. I've chosen in my organisation to put in place a general culture development around inclusion and respect, to put in place the basics and the foundations in place around development and processes. I have not specifically addressed LGBT as an issue, nor have I put in place any specific programs for that. Is it something that is a priority for me right now? Probably not. But if there was an issue, if there was a concern, the processes that we have put in place around the diversity and inclusion would allow us to address that. Does it advance them? Probably not. Does it disadvantage them? Probably not. So that's where we're at right now.
Thank you. Suzanne, I wonder if we could just pick it up from there, because I mean, obviously the sense that LGBT is the long end of D&I issues is quite a concern in a way, isn't it? I mean, how do you see this? I know that at one level you don't see that bundling LGBT and gender together is necessarily helpful. What is your thought?
I actually think that you need both. So, of course, you need to think systemically, and I definitely agree in terms of a culture of respect, developing inclusive behaviours, which would mean inclusiveness of any kind of different aspects of diversity. But what I find is, for example, if I'm coming into a company doing unconscious bias training, inclusion leadership training, it used to be I was brought in for 2 days, then it was 1 day. Now it's 3 or 4 hours. And in half a day, there's only so much we can cover. And if we're covering different aspects of diversity, we do mention LGBT, but it maybe gets a few minutes. If we're doing some application piece and we ask people to choose something that speaks to them to do the application around, they'll choose something they're comfortable with and that they feel a little bit safer with. The good thing, I guess, the little bit of progress I do see is a few years ago, if I mentioned LGBT or explained sexual identity diversity, gender identity in a training program, I used to get 14-year-old giggles and from the people, not from myself, of course. And these days, the giggles have stopped. So I think, well, okay, at least people are ready to be mature with this topic. But I think, you know, yes, you need to have this in general, but at the same time, you need to have some LGBT-specific initiatives in place as well. And, you know, one of the best practices, if you start realizing your own biases and some people that you avoid or you're less comfortable with or you're not inclusive of or you don't seem to be developing and promoting, if you realize what those different aspects of diversity are, which may be LGBT, one of the best practices is to spend time around people who are from that group, understanding a little bit more about them, about how your behaviors may be impacting them. And one of the ways to do that could be to have an internal session, even if it's once a year, a session that's devoted to LGBT. Could be part of learning curriculum, could be something that an LGBT allies and you know, employee resource group are pulling off.
What you're suggesting, of course, is that time is needed and effort and money, and
Yes.
And to get that, you need the leadership. You need somebody to say in the senior leadership of the company that this is necessary, don't you?
Absolutely, and I totally understand where Gail's coming from. I think, you know, whether it's from an HR perspective, a business perspective, there are always other priorities, and diversity and inclusion in general will often take a lower rung, and LGBT, if I talk with, you know, I'd maybe talk with 20, 30 different companies in a year about their diversity and inclusion strategy, how I can work with them, they always identify, here are our key pillars: gender, workplace flexibility, global markets, the cross-cultural piece, that one's nice and safe. And then if I push people with disabilities, LGBT, then often it's like, oh, well, we're not quite ready for that. Or, well, we haven't seen our competitors doing it, so we're not pushed over the edge yet. Or we haven't had an issue come up that's going to force us to do something about this yet.
So again, we come back to this sort of this almost mandatory requirement that you need to be pushed to do something. But
yeah.
you mentioned earlier that you know, in some ways you have to address not just the question of LGBT within your organisation, but sometimes the question of somebody's own attitudes towards diversity.
Right.
I mean, there's two sides of the coin, isn't it? But yet, that seems to me to be, that's a coaching job at one level, isn't it? I mean, it's and it does require a lot of input, and it also requires somebody to sign off on a fair amount of
budget and
a fair amount of
resource,
budget
yes.
for that to happen as well.
I think that is somewhere where we can learn a little bit, though, from some of the initiatives we've done around gender, is that on the one hand, systemically, we will have inclusion, leadership, management programs, and then also we have some programs for women. And for them, it could be looking at, I as a woman, understanding some of the biases about me that could be holding me back in my career. How do I navigate some of that? And the fact is that we have biases about our own groups. You know, there's something called internal oppression, where unconsciously we've bought into some of the biases about our own groups. And whether it's through coaching or through some small, intimate training session targeting a particular group, then you can take a look at, well, what does my own oppression, where does that come up? Where is that impacting me navigating my career or impacting decisions I'm making about people of my own group?
Just briefly, before I turn to the audience and turn to everybody online, this question of feeling safe, this question of addressing the fear that people have that coming out in their organizations could potentially have consequences for them. I know that you've had interesting experiences bringing together the Interbank LGBT Forum, and that itself was a way of kind of taking it out of organizations into a broader forum, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Are those kind of strategies, and perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that, but briefly, are those kind of strategies really appropriate and relevant in this context?
I believe so. I think at the crux of the matter is ultimately fear, right? And then maybe envy, shame, anger, etc. And so people are often not out because they don't feel safe to be, and they may be afraid of some prejudice, or it could be that often in an organization, people will demonstrate the success profile characteristics of the dominant profile. And that means that they're assimilating to some degree. For LGBT, it might then mean that they're guarded and they're hiding certain aspects about themselves. Gender, it may be acting on more masculine styles of leadership, for example. And I think, that's obviously a sort of natural thing that people will do, and they're hiding some part of them out of fear. I won't be promoted, I may be judged. And so one thing is, of course, taking out the fear for that so they can bring their whole self to work. A specific initiative that I did, this is quite a few years ago actually, when I was internal, and I was head of diversity and inclusion at UBS. And there was nobody identifying themselves as LGBT, and I wanted to have a network, but nobody was identifying themselves. And so I reached out, I guessed there must be at least 10% people here who probably are, but they're not safe. So I decided to assume the role of establishing an LGBT network myself, even though I'm not LGBT. And I reached out to other banks and asked, is this somewhere where we can collaborate? And we started the LGBT forum, Interbank Forum in Japan, which then became a model for elsewhere. And where that was really helpful was that I just assumed we need some resource and some forum here. Because it was Interbank, we took it off-site. And so then we would have a neutral venue where then people didn't need to worry who saw them going along to the event. And then that meant that gradually more and more people from my company started to attend those events. And when they started to feel safer and safer, then they stepped forward and said, Suzanne, we'll run this network now. And usually as head of D&I would not want to run a network myself. I need to find sponsors and people to do it for me. But there was nobody feeling safe enough, so I needed to demonstrate this is a safe place. I took a lot of flack. I got a lot of mails shouted at, what are you doing? What are we spending our budget on? But I decided I'm safe enough to stand up to this.
Good for you. Well, I wonder if the audience has any thoughts and any questions around that. Yes, down on that table there, please.
Hi there, Stephen Golden from Goldman Sachs. Maybe I'll give a controversial view to say that I don't think inclusion has to cost a lot of money. And if it does cost money, it probably costs less than the cost of discrimination. But just assuming for a moment that companies here don't have a budget and don't have much resource, like what are one or two recommendations you'd give them to kind of start on the path, but without any money or dedicated resource?
Okay.
Yeah, so what I would say, I don't think we ever have enough resources to do anything, to be honest. We're always short. But I think I would always start with the leadership. So I think you need a corporate sponsor who actually believes in this. Because without that leader putting bandweight behind it, I don't think it'll work. And I think once you've got that, a lot of this is around putting into place programs or education or support mechanisms, asking people what they want, putting into place the connections and the networks that enable people to talk about it, bring it out into the open, and then thinking about what they need. I always find diversity programs works best when the programs themselves are inclusive and they're not exclusive. They're not exclusive to just that diverse group. And where you get acceptance is where you start to talk about it. So a lot of it's education, but I think it starts with the leader. So if we've got leaders in this room and you think this is important, then I'd suggest you make sure it's a priority on the agenda.
Susan.
Yeah, then I guess from leadership, I'll take the other side. And I do agree with Stephen, you don't necessarily need a lot of resources. From grassroots side, then I think one of the best initiatives you can put in place at first is to have an LGBT employee resource group network with allies. And I think, again, that's where we've learned something from gender, is you don't want only people who are LGBT in the room. You need allies, supporters, curious about. I think that's one of the key initiatives to put in place. I think the other thing is, if we look again at gender, people often want to believe that they don't discriminate, that they value inclusion, they're managing their biases. And in fact, we're human and we are biased. And if we look at gender inclusion, people often say, oh, well, don't worry, over time, the numbers will balance out, younger women coming into the workplace, we've got a good pipeline. And yet, it's going to take 122 years before we reach gender parity. And we can assume that for LGBT inclusion, the number looks like that too. So if we want to see some changes in our lifetime, we're going to have to get proactive and put some initiatives in place.
Good thought. Other questions, other thoughts? The audience. Down here, please.
Hi, I'm Lauren Degny from Deutsche Bank. So just a couple of, maybe a little bit of an answer to your question, which ties on to the grassroots point as well, and share a little bit of our experience. We have actually taken a very much a grassroots approach to it. I would actually challenge the leadership argument. I think there are a lot of claims on leaders' time. And we have leaders and we have managers, and they're not always the same people. And I think we've taken very much the grassroots approach, where we've got employee networks that we've set up. The vast majority of our network members are actually allies. We have a very strong ally program that we proliferate around the region, because our belief is this is really a grassroots thing. And it's through the grassroots, and I think it was touched on in one of the earlier panels, that we start to invigorate change. And we put pressure on our managers and on our leaders for them to make this acceptable and for them to make this part of their agenda. Because if their staff are speaking and demanding more of them, they then have to act. And that's really the approach. We're at the very start, but that's the approach we're taking. And we've seen to have a pretty good success so far. And I think, again, it goes back to the point made earlier on one of the panels, which is making the invisible visible. And that's the approach we're taking as well.
Is one of the challenges of that, and I put it to all three of you, is one of the challenges that somehow you carry the foreign staff quite often in that process, but it's quite difficult to carry the local staff who are worried about many of the broader social implications and issues sitting around coming out in the context of their own work environment. And is that an issue that you face?
It's quite funny, actually. We have a diversity week, and we actually this sounds ridiculous, but we started with something as innocuous as offering a cupcake, very brightly coloured, colourful colours of the rainbow cupcakes at our luncheon venue, which was quite funny, and it drew people up. Oh, we'll always take a free cupcake. What do you want in return? And I said, well, I want to know, that you'll sign up and be part of our network. What does the network mean? And the vast majority of people who signed up on the day were local Hong Kong employees. Overwhelmingly Hong Kong employees. They took away ally cards, they took away ally banners and attached them to their desk. And that surprised me, and it surprised everyone at the table, because I honestly thought it was going to be a much more expatriate agenda than a local one. And it was amazing to see.
Really interesting. I wonder if anybody else would like to share their own experiences in their organisation around that as well. It seems to be very interesting that that's the case. Blinded by the lights, I can't see the spread of hands going up. None. All right, well...
Can I add
yes,
one other
Suzanne.
initiative that I think can be highly useful is having an LGBT campus recruiting event, and therefore then you're talking with talent of the future, people that will hopefully join your organisation. I think that can be highly informative and another way of increasing LGBT awareness internally and outside in the markets. And I think likewise, having, for example, LGBT employee resource group doing some presentation back to the business on how some initiative that they were involved with helped the bottom line.
Just one of the questions we were talking about, and I think it's important we all ask this question. So you've talked about a really good initiative at a grassroots level. What sparks it?
Yeah, that's an incredibly good question. What, at a particular... we were mentioning this...
I'd be welcome. I'd actually welcome...
Yeah, what at a particular point in
What
time
sparks it?
gets you to work on this particular issue?
Sure. So again, it is certainly an infrastructure that's put in place around it. The grassroots spark on our side is, we want to be, if you're a young, and this goes back to young people, we want to be seen as leaders. We want to be given a platform. We want to be given a voice. And we're not being given that, given the way that structures work in terms of demographics at the management level in finance, and this is everyone. This is the way we get our voice. This is the way we impact a business. And really the spark is young leaders who don't get a leadership voice in the big tent at the top table. We take initiatives at the grassroots and say, well, I want an opportunity to lead. I want a voice with management. You make yourself a platform, you work with the people that it impacts, and you get that voice. And that's really been the spark on our side. We see it across a lot of our networks, is young people leading the way.
Well, it seems to me that, and I'm afraid we have run out of time and we must keep this afternoon on time, but it seems to me that one of the takeaways is that if you want to accelerate the process around LGBT, you actually have to be proactive around it within the organisation and get on with it, otherwise it isn't going to happen. There are plenty of other priorities that could come into place. So with that,
Make sure the basics are in place, but you have to be proactive. Because will not happen without it.
Gail, thank you very much. Do please thank Gail and